The date, etched in mud and fear, was October the 23rd, 1944. The location was the dark, sprawling forests of Belgium, a place where the trees grew thick and the German border was unsettlingly close. Huddled in their defensive positions, Wehrmacht soldiers waited. These were not the fresh-faced conscripts of the late war. These were hardened, battle-scarred veterans. These were men who carried the frost of the Russian steppes in their bones and the grit of the North African deserts under their skin. They had fought and survived across the entirety of the European continent. They had witnessed the absolute best and the unimaginable worst that this global conflict could offer. They had faced the relentless British regularity and weathered the storm of Soviet brutality. Now they waited for yet another American unit to come and test their iron. But something about this felt different. The intelligence reports filtering through the German headquarters spoke of a new American division, the 104th Infantry, calling themselves the Timberwolves. They were fresh troops, straight from the United States, never having seen the white-hot intensity of real combat. The German officers, veterans of a dozen campaigns, permitted themselves a grim, knowing smile. Green American soldiers, farm boys and factory workers who had likely never seen war outside of a newsreel. This, they concluded, would be easy. They had broken American units before. What these German soldiers could not possibly know, what their intelligence reports had failed to mention, was that these Timberwolves were commanded by a man they would very soon learn to fear. A man whose very name would become a warning, a curse whispered among Wehrmacht troops in the darkness. He was a general so aggressive, so dangerously unconventional, so utterly relentless in his pursuit of victory, that his own high command had already fired him once. His name was Terry de la Mesa Allen. The Americans called him Terrible Terry, and he was about to teach the Germans a lesson in terror they would never forget. The story of how this happened, how one American general became the living nightmare of German forces across two separate continents, is not a simple story about military tactics or battlefield victories. It is a story about a man who fundamentally refused to follow the rules, especially when those rules were getting his soldiers killed. He was a man who drank too much, who cursed too freely, and who cared infinitely more about winning the next battle than he did about wearing a clean uniform. He was the man who was fired in disgrace at the absolute height of his success, only to return from exile, more focused and more dangerous than ever before. To truly understand why German soldiers learned to fear Terry Allen, we must go back to where the legend began. Terry Allen was born on April 1st, 1888, at Fort Douglas in the Utah Territory. He was, from his first breath, a child of the military. He came from a family tradition that stretched back generations. His father was Colonel Samuel Allen, a career Army officer who had spent his entire adult life in uniform, moving from one frontier post to another across the American West. But the military tradition ran even deeper, steeped in the blood of the nation's most defining conflict. His maternal grandfather, Captain Carlos Alvarez de la Mesa, had fought for the Union at Gettysburg, one of the most savage and pivotal battles in American history. Captain de la Mesa served with the 39th New York Volunteer Infantry, a unit known as the Garibaldi Guard, composed largely of immigrants who had come to America seeking freedom and found themselves fighting to preserve it. On the second day of that terrible battle, Captain de Mesa was wounded in the chaotic fighting around the peach orchard. He survived and he continued to serve. This heritage of service, of sacrifice, ran through Terry Allen's veins. Military life wasn't just a career in the Allen family. It was blood. It was destiny. It was the family business passed down from the Civil War through the Indian Wars, awaiting whatever conflicts the 20th century would bring. Young Terry grew up on these military posts. He learned to ride horses before he could properly read. He learned to shoot long before he mastered arithmetic. He was a child of the old army, the cavalry army, an army that still believed wars would be won by men on horseback, charging across open fields. This upbringing would shape everything about him, for better and for worse. In 1907, Terry received the honor every military family dreamed of, an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Here was his chance to follow in his father's footsteps, to become an officer in the grandest, most respected tradition. He failed spectacularly. Terry Allen despised West Point. He hated the endless mathematics. He chafed under the rigid, uncompromising discipline. He hated sitting in classrooms when he wanted to be doing something, anything other than studying. He stuttered in class. He collected demerits for minor infractions. His restless, boundless energy earned him the nickname, "Tear 'em around the mess hall Allen." The academy was designed for men who could sit still, follow orders without question, and memorize textbooks. Terry Allen was built for action. In 1911, he was dismissed after failing ordnance and gunnery, having already been held back for failing mathematics. For most men, this would have been the end. The shame of failing at West Point was enough to extinguish any military aspiration. But Allen was stubborn. If the traditional path wouldn't work, he would find another way. He enrolled at the Catholic University of America. He studied, he worked, and he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree. On November 30th, 1912, he received his commission as a second lieutenant in the cavalry of the United States Army. He had made it, not through the front door, but by kicking in a side window through sheer, relentless determination. This pattern, this absolute refusal to accept defeat, this willingness to find another way when the official path was blocked, would come to define his entire career. Allen served as a cavalry officer on the Mexican border in 1913. One day, Lieutenant Allen led just 6 soldiers against 30 Mexican cattle rustlers who had crossed into American territory. Military doctrine said to wait, to call for reinforcements. Allen attacked. He captured or killed all 30. This was not the action of a careful by-the-book officer. This was the action of a man who saw what needed to be done and did it. Consequences be damned. Then came the Great War. Allen desperately wanted to get into the fight, fearing, like many young officers, that the war would end before he could prove himself in combat. When he finally shipped to France in 1918, it was not to lead a combat unit. He was assigned to the 315th Ammunition Train, hauling artillery shells to the front lines. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't what he wanted, but he was there. Eventually, he got his chance. He was assigned to command the 3rd Battalion of the 358th Infantry Regiment. He led his men into the battles at Saint-Mihiel, and later in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest battle in American military history. It was here, in the mud and blood of the Western Front, that Allen developed his signature tactical innovation, night attacks. Most commanders avoided night operations. They were too confusing, too chaotic. The risk of friendly fire was too high. Standard doctrine taught at military schools was to defend at night and attack in daylight, when you could see the enemy and coordinate. Allen saw something different. He noticed, through his own combat experience, that properly executed night attacks resulted in fewer casualties. Daylight attacks against prepared machine gun positions were horrific, a meat grinder. But at night all those advantages disappeared. The element of surprise saved lives. The confusion that made other commanders nervous actually worked in favor of the attackers. Defenders couldn't see what was coming. Artillery fired blindly. Most importantly, defenders were terrified, firing at shadows, breaking under the psychological pressure of an enemy they could not see. He developed specific techniques, careful daylight reconnaissance, detailed briefings, simple plans. He taught his men that complexity was the enemy. Know your objective, move silently, and when discovered, hit hard and fast. On October 24, 1918, Allen was shot in the face with machine gun fire. He was tagged for medical evacuation. He persuaded the doctors to return him quickly to duty. He stayed with his men. This was leadership. His soldiers saw their commander, blood streaming down his face, refusing to leave them. He was awarded the Silver Star and 2 Purple Hearts. The war ended. Allen returned to a United States that wanted peace. And now came the hard part, 20 years of peacetime Army life. These interwar years were brutal for ambitious officers. The Army shrank from over 4 million men to barely 130,000. An entire generation found their careers frozen. Men who had commanded battalions in combat were stuck as captains for a decade or more. Allen was no exception, but he made the most of those lean years. In 1920, he competed in a 300-mile horseback race, winning the brutal contest. That same year, he won a bronze medal in polo at the 1920 Summer Olympics. He was a cavalryman through and through, a horseman of the old army. But he was also watching the world change. He studied military history obsessively. He analyzed World War I. He studied the German army, their tactics, their doctrine. He followed the developments in tank warfare, aviation, and radio communications. He understood the next war would be different. Horses would not matter. Mobility and firepower would decide battles. Most importantly, he never stopped training his men hard, always preparing for the war he knew would eventually come. Then, on October 1st, 1940, everything changed. General George C. Marshall, the new Army Chief of Staff, was rebuilding the military. Marshall had a gift for spotting talent. He looked at Lieutenant Colonel Terry Allen and saw the fighter others had missed. Marshall promoted Allen directly from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. It was almost unheard of. In May 1942, Allen received the command that would define his career, the 1st Infantry Division. The Big Red One, the oldest and proudest division in the American Army. On November 8, 1942, the Big Red One landed at Oran, Algeria, as part of Operation Torch. This was the first American offensive in the European theater. Allen led from the front, as he always did. But the real test came in Tunisia. The campaign was brutal. The Germans, under Rommel, were experienced desert fighters. The Americans were learning lessons in blood. In February 1943, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive at Kasserine Pass. American units, inexperienced and poorly led, broke and ran. It was a disaster. German tanks smashed through defensive positions. But on February 21st, Allen led a strong counterattack, personally directing artillery fire and stabilizing the line. The disaster was contained. Then came Guettar in March 1943. This would become Allen's defining battle. The Germans attacked with tanks. On March 23rd, the crisis came. German tanks broke through the forward positions and threatened Allen's headquarters. Staff officers suggested pulling back. The suggestion made tactical sense. Divisional headquarters were not supposed to be in the direct line of fire, but Allen understood something his staff did not. If the headquarters pulled back, the forward units would see it and waver. Morale could collapse in an instant. Allen's response entered military legend. "I will like hell pull out, and I will shoot the first bastard who does." The headquarters stayed. Allen walked outside and calmly watched the German tanks approach. His demeanor steadied his staff. The forward units held. The attack was repulsed. The line held. El Guettar was the first major American defeat of experienced German tank units in the war. The Germans had met an American commander who would not retreat. In May 1943, the 1st Infantry Division led the final drive on Tunis, and the North Africa campaign was over. Now came Sicily. On July 10, 1943, Allen led the 1st Division ashore at Gela, the most difficult landing zone. General Patton had specifically requested them for the job. The next day, German tanks from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division counterattacked, trying to drive them back into the sea. American infantry fought desperately. Naval gunfire roared over their heads, but the Big Red One held. The beachhead was secure. The hardest fighting, however, was still ahead. At the mountain town of Troina, the Germans had built a fortress. From July 31st to August 6th, Allen's division attacked this stronghold. The fighting was savage. Every building was a pillbox. Every street was covered by machine guns. The Germans didn't just defend, they counterattacked. Again and again, they launched furious attacks to throw the Americans back down the mountain. By the time the battle ended, the Germans had launched 24 separate counterattacks over 6 days. 24 times, Allen's men beat them back. The division was exhausted, but Troina fell. The road to Messina was open. On August 9, 1943, Time magazine published its latest issue. On the cover was Major General Terry Allen, praised as a great division commander. There was just one problem. On August 7th, 2 days before the magazine hit newsstands, Omar Bradley had relieved Allen from command. The reasons were complex. Bradley believed Allen had let discipline slip, that the Big Red One had become too arrogant, too confident. Recent scholarship suggests the relief was pre-planned by Eisenhower and Patton. They believed Allen was the right man for the toughest initial fighting, but not the right man for the long war ahead. At the peak of his success, Terry Allen was sent home. Most officers would have retired in bitterness. Allen asked for another chance. On October 15, 1943, he took command of the 104th Infantry Division. These were not battle-hardened veterans. These were green troops, mostly factory workers and farm boys. They knew nothing about combat. Allen looked at these young men and set out to create the most thoroughly trained division in the United States Army. And he would do it by teaching them to master the one thing most units avoided: fighting at night. While standard training required 10 to 12 hours per week of tactical instruction, Allen drove his men through 30 to 35 hours per week. The training was relentless, exhausting, and brutally realistic. He focused obsessively on night operations, drilling them in total darkness, using live ammunition and actual artillery barrages. His men learned that night fighting was terrifying, but that training and discipline could turn that terror into a weapon. By the time the 104th shipped to Europe in 1944, they were the first and only American division trained specifically for nighttime combat. Bradley himself would later admit that Allen brought the only division he knew of that was prepared for night combat. That preparation would save countless lives. Which brings us back to that Belgian forest on October 23, 1944. The German veterans waited for easy pickings. What they got was a nightmare. That first night, Allen launched his division into action. The attacks came in darkness. Companies moved silently through the forests, hitting German positions from unexpected directions. Sentries were eliminated before they could sound an alarm. Positions were overrun before defenders understood what was happening. Machine gun nests fired blindly into the black. American infantry materialized out of the darkness, struck hard, and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. By dawn, the Germans were shaken. This was not a green division. These were trained killers who fought like demons in the dark. German unit commanders sent urgent reports. This American division was different. They owned the night. Over the next months, the pattern repeated. The 104th crossed the Mark River in a night operation that caught German defenders completely by surprise. When the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge, Allen's division held its defensive positions. Then they went back on the attack, driving into Germany itself. The reputation of the Timberwolves spread. Wehrmacht soldiers warned each other about the American division that attacked at night. German propaganda broadcaster Axis Sally complained in broadcasts that the American night fighting was unfair. This was high praise. On March 5, 1945, the Timberwolves captured Cologne. On March the 22nd, they crossed the Rhine. On April 11th, the 104th liberated the Nordhausen concentration camp. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Approximately 3,000 corpses lay scattered throughout the camp. They found 750 prisoners, skeletal and barely alive, who had been worked to death building V-2 rockets. Allen's soldiers, hardened by months of combat, were sickened. This was systematic, industrial-scale murder. Allen ordered his men to photograph everything. He ordered German civilians from the nearby town to be brought to the camp to see what had been done in their name. From April 15th to 19th, the division fought a 5-day battle to capture the city of Halle. During this operation, Allen encountered Count Felix von Luckner, a famed German naval raider from World War I. Von Luckner, now an old man, helped negotiate a partial surrender of the city, saving it from total destruction, on April 26, 1945. At the Elbe River, soldiers of the 104th Infantry Division made contact with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The Third Reich was cut in two. The war in Europe was nearly over. Allen's division had been in continuous combat for 200 days. Not one major objective failed, not one attack beaten back. In early 1945, Omar Bradley, the man who had fired Allen in Sicily, visited his headquarters. He was impressed. The 104th was performing magnificently. Bradley told Allen, "Terry, I am pleasantly surprised to see these young Timberwolves of yours already ranked along with the 1st and the 9th as the finest assault divisions in the European theater." The 1st Division was Allen's old command. To be ranked with them was extraordinary praise. Allen's response was pure Terry Allen. "Brad," he said, "the 1st and the 9th are in damned fast company." He had proven his point. The methods that got him fired had produced another elite division. He had shown his success was not a fluke. His methods worked. He retired from the Army on August 31st, 1946, as a Major General. He had never received his 3rd star. Perhaps that was the price of being too aggressive, too unconventional, too much of a fighter and not enough of a diplomat. War correspondent Ernie Pyle had written it best. If there was one thing in the world Allen lived and breathed for, it was to fight. After retirement, Allen lived quietly in El Paso, Texas. But peace would not last. On October 17, 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Terry de la Mesa Allen, Jr. was killed in Vietnam. He was commanding the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, his father's old division, the Big Red One. In fact, it was the very same battalion his father had commanded decades earlier in World War I. The family tradition of service continued, and it ended in tragedy. Allen Jr. was killed leading his men in an ambush. The death of his son shattered Terry Allen. He was 79 years old, and this blow was too much. His health collapsed. The will to fight was gone. On September the 12th, 1969, Major General Terry Allen died. He was buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery next to his son. The old cavalryman, the warrior of 2 world wars, was finally at rest. Today, the United States Military Academy at West Point, the institution that dismissed him in 1911 for academic failure, presents the General Terry de la Mesa Allen Award to the cadet with the highest rating in military science. The academy that could not contain him as a student now honors his name. The failed cadet became one of the most successful combat commanders in American history. The Germans in those Belgian forests learned that lesson the hard way. The ones who survived spread the word. Terrible Terry was back, and the night belonged to him.